Welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling cases ever documented in Kentucky's history. Before we proceed, I encourage you to share in the comments where you're listening from and the exact moment you're hearing this narration. We're genuinely curious to know what locations and what hours of the day or night these recorded stories manage to reach. The autumn season of 1907 descended upon Harlan County with a peculiar stillness. Below the valleys where Pine Mountain cast its elongated shadows, numerous hunting cabins were scattered throughout the landscape adjacent to the Cumberland River. According to county documentation preserved by the Harlan County Historical Society, between September and December of that particular year, 7 men who had entered these woodlands for hunting purposes failed to return to their residences. The formal disappearances were recorded within ledgers that have since yellowed through the passing years. Every entry was inscribed in the painstaking cursive of County Clerk Thomas Whitfield. Each individual was documented with his age, profession, last known whereabouts, and a brief annotation: no remains recovered. Regional newspapers, chiefly the Harlan Daily Enterprise, covered these disappearances as isolated incidents, presumably attributable to severe weather patterns or assaults by wild animals. The editorial published on October 28, 1907 proposed that the wilderness claims what is owed to it each season. This sentiment reflected the matter-of-fact acceptance of perils inherent to the Appalachian wilderness during that period. However, a collection of journals uncovered in 1962 during the restoration of an old farmstead suggested something considerably more disturbing had transpired within those woods. The restoration project was a component of a federal program aimed at developing recreational zones within what would later become the Daniel Boone National Forest. The homestead, positioned approximately 23 miles southeast of central Harlan, had remained deserted for numerous decades. Based on the account of the work crew's foreman, Samuel Ledbetter, which was documented in an internal Forest Service memorandum dated June 17, 1962, the journals were discovered beneath a loose floorboard in what had originally served as the primary living area of a substantial log cabin. The journals were the property of Tobias and Elijah Blackwood, 2 brothers who possessed approximately 300 acres of heavily forested terrain in the southeastern section of the county. The property deed, filed in 1876 and transferred to the brothers in 1899 subsequent to their father's passing, characterized the land as ascending from Cumberland waters to the summit of Pine Mountain, encompassing Bear Creek Hollow and the eastern face of Stony Point. The journals, 3 volumes bound in leather containing pages crafted from handmade paper, held daily records spanning from 1899 through late 1907. What follows is an account assembled from these journals, county documentation, newspaper clippings, and discussions conducted with descendants of Harlan County inhabitants from that period. The inquiry was never formally concluded, and in 1967 the matter was permanently archived at the Kentucky State Historical Society, where it stays mostly overlooked. Within McCreary County, the adjacent jurisdiction, the Blackwood brothers were recognized as solitary trappers who would periodically exchange animal pelts in the modest settlement of Whitley City. This town, founded in 1868 as a logging camp, consisted of little beyond a general store, a modest church, and a grouping of wooden dwellings arranged alongside a solitary muddy thoroughfare. According to trading post ledgers dated between 1903 and 1906, carefully maintained by proprietor Harold Jenkins, the brothers would appear roughly every 3 months to barter furs for provisions. Jenkins's record books, given to the McCreary County Historical Society by his granddaughter in 1948, cataloged the goods the brothers typically obtained: salt, coffee beans, ammunition, occasionally implements, and very seldom tobacco for Elijah. The ledgers show that the brothers conversed minimally and conducted their transactions efficiently before heading back to their land. Entry dated March 12, 1905. Blackwoods appeared at sunrise. Traded 7 fox pelts, 3 beaver, and 1 bear hide of remarkable quality. Exchanged for standard supplies, plus 1 steel trap and a whetstone. Departed before other customers came in. Paid balance of $1.37 in silver coins dated 1878 and 1881. The trading post owner Harold Jenkins observed in his personal journal that the brothers carried themselves with an unsettling silence and that other patrons would create space when they walked in. An entry from November 1904 states, "The elder Blackwood, Tobias, stands near 6 and 1/2 feet tall with shoulders reminiscent of an ox. His hands display the scars of countless seasons spent in wilderness, yet he handles coins with the precision of a banker. His brother, smaller but equally imposing, monitors the entrance as if anticipating trouble that never materializes. They pass through my establishment like wolves among sheep, and I find myself inspecting my inventory more thoroughly following their departures, though nothing has ever gone missing. Jenkins also observed that the brothers looked exceptionally well-nourished for men dwelling so far into the wilderness, particularly throughout winter months when game was limited. Their robust physical condition stood in marked contrast to other mountain inhabitants who typically became thin during the severe Kentucky winters. When questioned regarding their hunting success, Tobias, the elder brother, would simply respond that they possessed methods of keeping the table consistently supplied. This puzzling reply appears numerous times throughout Jenkins's diary entries covering 4 years, indicating the merchant's ongoing curiosity regarding their unusual prosperity. The brothers' cabin was situated in a remote clearing approximately 17 miles from the closest neighbor, reachable only by a narrow dirt track that wound through thick pine forest. Based on the memories of James Harkins, a logger whose father had once transported provisions to the Blackwood property in 1901, the approach to the cabin was distinguished by peculiar arrangements of stones positioned at inconsistent intervals beside the path. Harkins, questioned in 1964 by local historian Margaret Wilson, recalled his father characterizing the stones as standing like silent sentinels, and how they appear to watch you with invisible eyes. The pathway itself was described as unusually level and well-kept for such a remote location, broad enough for a horse but not a wagon, obligating visitors to approach in single file. The site was indicated on an 1899 survey map commissioned by the Kentucky Land Office, but subsequent maps from 1910 onward exclude any reference to the property or its buildings. It seems as if the landscape itself agreed to forget. The 1910 Geological Survey performed as part of a coal exploration initiative displays only uninhabited wilderness where the Blackwood property should have been located, despite the cabin's robust construction which should have endured well past that time. The cabin itself, according to the limited number who had observed it, was remarkably large for a wilderness dwelling. Constructed from hand-hewn oak logs notched and fitted with extraordinary precision, it included a stone foundation that extended approximately 10 feet into the earth, creating what witnesses characterized as a complete underground level accessible through a trapdoor in the main room. Luther Collins, a hunting guide who claimed to have visited the cabin once in 1906, provided a statement to the Harlan County Sheriff in 1908 during the delayed investigation into the disappearances. His description, kept in the case records, observes that the main level contained a sizable central room with a massive stone fireplace, 2 smaller rooms presumably serving as bedrooms, and a separate kitchen area featuring an unusual brick oven integrated into the wall. Collins reported that what struck him most was the brothers' assortment of knives exhibited on a wooden rack near the kitchen entrance. Must have been 30 or 40 different blades, his statement reads. Some I identified as hunting or skinning knives, yet others appeared to be surgical implements, all kept polished and organized by dimension. Elijah noticed me looking and mentioned they were family heirlooms originating from their father's period as a field medic during the war. Before the hunting season of 1907, the Blackwood brothers had lived comparatively unnoticed by officials. Their land taxes were settled annually through a lawyer in Whitley City, a Mr. Jonathan Pierce, whose brief notations show that the brothers received the land from their father, who had obtained it during the post-Civil War land redistribution. Pierce's legal ledger, found in a filing cabinet contributed to the County Historical Society in 1951, contained minimal information regarding his unusual clients. His notes indicate that he encountered the brothers on only 2 occasions, once following their father's death to carry out the will, and again in 1902 to prepare a document ensuring that if either brother passed away, the property would transfer entirely to the survivor with no claims permitted from any other parties. Pierce observed that this request appeared peculiar given that neither brother was known to possess any other family or heirs, yet he carried out their request without objection. According to courthouse records, the elder Blackwood had been a Union soldier who obtained the parcel as remuneration for his military service. Military records examined in 1965 by researchers identified him as Sergeant Ezekiel Blackwood, formerly of the 13th Kentucky Volunteer Infantry, Company C. His service record indicated he functioned as a field hospital assistant during the final years of the conflict, with a notation that he was notably adept at amputation techniques. Pierce's notes found in the same filing cabinet mentioned that the brothers' father had peculiar dietary requirements that necessitated their secluded lifestyle. In a letter to a colleague dated 1904, Pierce expanded somewhat, writing, "The elder Blackwood suffered from some digestive condition acquired during his military service. According to his sons, he could consume only exceptionally fresh meat prepared in specific ways, or he would experience terrible suffering. This condition apparently influenced his selection of such an isolated homestead, where game was plentiful and neighbors were few." No additional explanation was offered, and medical documentation from the period was not sufficiently detailed to determine what condition might have necessitated such particular dietary limitations. The brothers themselves had received no formal education beyond what their father had instructed them in, and neither had ever entered into marriage. Their seclusion was nearly absolute except for their quarterly trading expeditions. Local youngsters were cautioned to stay away from the area near Pine Mountain where the Blackwoods resided, though no particular reason was given beyond the typical warnings about respecting private property. Eliza Jenkins, daughter of the Trading Post owner, recalled in a 1966 interview that her father would remark, "Those who wander onto Blackwood land tend not to wander back off it." What precipitated the events of 1907 continues to be uncertain. Some propose it was the unusually cold September that pushed game animals deeper into the mountains, leading hunters to venture further into Blackwood territory than in previous years. Meteorological records from the Louisville Weather Station indicate that September 1907 experienced temperatures averaging 12 degrees below normal, with an early frost on September 10 that harmed crops across the region. Others reference a county ordinance approved that summer which eliminated private property restrictions for licensed hunters during hunting season. A measure intended to prevent wealthy landowners from monopolizing the prime hunting grounds. The ordinance, kept in county records, specified that from September 1 to December 31, licensed hunters may pursue game across property boundaries provided they do not damage structures or livestock. The Blackwoods reportedly appeared at a county meeting to oppose this ordinance, one of their only known appearances in town, but their objections were dismissed. The meeting minutes note only that objection was raised by residents of Pine Mountain District without specifically naming the brothers. Whatever the reason, it introduced strangers into the brothers' domain, and something within the Blackwoods changed. The initial disappearance happened on September 17, 1907. William Thornton, a 43-year-old bank employee from Lexington, had journeyed to Harlan County with 3 companions for their yearly hunting excursion, a tradition they had kept up for 5 years. They set up a camp near the Cumberland River, roughly 7 miles from the Blackwood property. According to a statement provided to the Harlan County Sheriff by Edward Rollins, one of Thornton's companions, William had informed them he was going to inspect traps along the eastern ridge of Pine Mountain. He was in good spirits that morning, Rollins stated, having shot a sizable buck the preceding day. He mentioned intending to set traps rather than hunt directly, as he thought the cold weather had driven smaller game into the higher elevations. Thornton departed camp at roughly 8:30 in the morning, carrying his Winchester rifle, a skinning knife, and a small pack containing food and water. When he had not returned by nightfall, his companions grew worried. Based on the sheriff's report filed on September 20, 1907, Thornton's 3 companions waited until nightfall before conducting a search. They discovered his rifle leaning against a tree roughly 4 miles from their camp, along with a partially filled canteen and a blood-stained handkerchief. The report observes that the rifle seemed to have been positioned deliberately rather than dropped, indicating Mr. Thornton had set it aside intentionally. No other trace of the men was found. The sheriff's report notes that a storm moved in that evening, erasing any potential tracks. A search party consisting of the sheriff, 2 deputies, and numerous local volunteers combed the vicinity for 3 days, yet uncovered no additional evidence. The search was called off on September 23, with Sheriff Harlan Daniels determining that Thornton had likely experienced an accident in the rugged landscape and either died from injuries or was carried off by scavengers. The report's final notation reads, "Mr. Thornton's disappearance, while tragic, aligns with the hazards inherent to hunting in remote regions." His companions went back to Lexington, where Thornton's wife would later commission a headstone in Lexington Cemetery, though no body was ever recovered to place beneath it. A month later, on October 23, 2 brothers from Cincinnati, James and Robert Caldwell, failed to come back to their accommodations in Cumberland. The men, aged 28 and 31 respectively, were seasoned hunters who had traveled to Kentucky specifically to pursue white-tailed deer, which were plentiful in the region. They had arrived on October 20th and secured rooms at a boarding house operated by Mrs. Edith Simmons, a widow whose establishment catered to out-of-state hunters. The men had told their landlady that they planned to hunt deer in the southern portion of Harlan County near the Tennessee border. According to Mrs. Simmons's statement to Sheriff Daniels, recorded on October 25th, the brothers had mentioned discovering promising signs near a creek that feeds into the Cumberland up where the mountains get steep. This description matches the general vicinity of the Blackwood property, though Mrs. Simmons was not acquainted enough with the area to make that connection. The Caldwell brothers' horses returned to the stable without riders 2 days after the men departed. The stable hand, Joseph Miller, reported that the horses appeared agitated but not injured, and were still saddled. Mrs. Simmons reported in her statement that the saddlebags contained an unusual amount of meat wrapped in oilcloth, which she presumed to be venison. Not considering it important at the time, and assuming the brothers had perhaps gone to retrieve more game, she prepared the meat for her boarders. The meat was eaten by boarders before the brothers were officially reported missing. When investigators questioned her regarding the meat's appearance or taste, she noted nothing unusual, stating only that it was tender, as if from a young animal. She recalled that one boarder, a Mr. Douglas from Virginia, had remarked that it was the sweetest venison he'd ever tasted, and had inquired about the brothers' hunting location, so he might try his fortune in the same area. Mrs. Simmons did not recall if she had provided him with this information. Sheriff Daniels organized another search party when the Caldwell brothers were reported missing, concentrating on the area south of Cumberland where they had indicated they would be hunting. The search continued for 5 days, but produced no results beyond a single spent rifle cartridge that could not be definitively linked to either brother's weapon. The Cincinnati Enquirer published a brief article about the missing men on November 2, 1907, noting that they were believed lost to the perils of the Kentucky wilderness. Their parents journeyed to Harlan County in mid-November, but returned to Ohio without answers. In a tragic irony, Robert Caldwell's wife was expecting their first child, who would be born in February 1908, never having known his father. A letter from Mrs. Rebecca Caldwell to Sheriff Daniels, dated March 1908, and preserved in the case file, begs for any further information regarding her husband's fate. The sheriff's response, if one was sent, is not contained in the records. The third disappearance occurred in early November and involved a solitary hunter named Frederick Schmidt, a German immigrant who resided in Louisville and worked as a butcher. Schmidt, age 39, had journeyed to Harlan County alone on November 3. According to the guest register at the Railroad Hotel in Harlan Town, he signed out on the morning of November 5, informing the clerk he intended to hunt for several days before coming back. Schmidt never checked back into the hotel, and his disappearance was not observed until November 15 when he failed to return to his employment in Louisville. His employer, worried about his dependable worker's absence, contacted authorities. By the time Sheriff Daniels was notified, nearly 2 weeks had passed since Schmidt was last seen. A cursory search was conducted, but winter weather had set in, making a comprehensive investigation impossible. Schmidt's hunting equipment, including a distinctive German-made hunting rifle with his name engraved on the stock, was never recovered. The fourth and fifth disappearances took place simultaneously and involved 2 local men, brothers-in-law Thomas Howard and Peter Jenkins, who departed their homes in Cumberland on November 26 for what was intended as a 2-day hunting excursion. Howard, a coal miner, and Jenkins, a carpenter, were lifelong residents of Harlan County and acquainted with the landscape. According to statements from their wives, who were sisters, the men had mentioned hunting in the high country because game had grown scarce in their usual hunting areas closer to town. When they failed to return on November 28, their family members immediately notified Sheriff Daniels of their absence. A search party was rapidly assembled, consisting mainly of fellow miners and neighbors who knew the men well. Despite their familiarity with the region, the search party found no indication of Howard or Jenkins beyond their initial campsite, which seemed to have been vacated hastily. The campfire had been put out, yet their cooking utensils were left behind, along with a partially prepared rabbit carcass that had been abandoned to spoil. The men's rifles were missing, indicating they had been carrying weapons when they departed camp. The sixth disappearance, occurring on December 12, involved Reverend Isaiah Thornfield, an itinerant preacher from Tennessee who had been holding revival meetings in small communities across Harlan County. According to his assistant, a young man named Timothy Greer, Reverend Thornfield had expressed interest in delivering his message to the more isolated homesteads in the region. The Reverend believed no soul was too remote to receive the word. Greer stated in his report to authorities he had heard of reclusive families dwelling in the mountains who had not seen a preacher in years and felt called to minister to them. Thornfield departed on horseback on the morning of December 12 carrying his Bible and a small bag of provisions. His horse came back to the church in Harlan 3 days later without its rider. The saddlebags contained the Reverend's Bible, apparently untouched, but his other belongings were missing. Greer organized a search with church members, yet like the previous attempts, it produced no results. The final disappearance of the season, and perhaps the most disturbing in hindsight, occurred on December 23. Mary Caldwell, the sister of the missing Caldwell brothers, had journeyed from Cincinnati to Harlan County, determined to uncover what had happened to her brothers. Despite warnings about the hazardous winter conditions, she employed a local guide named Jeremiah Stone to take her to the area where her brothers had intended to hunt. According to Stone's subsequent statement to authorities, they set out on the morning of December 23, following the general direction Mrs. Simmons had indicated the Caldwell brothers had taken. Stone reported that as they approached the foothills of Pine Mountain, Mary Caldwell had insisted on proceeding alone for a short distance to a ridge where she thought she could obtain a better view of the surrounding landscape. Stone claimed he recommended against this, but gave in to her insistence, agreeing to wait with the horses. After roughly 30 minutes, he grew concerned and followed her path, yet discovered no trace of her. As darkness approached, he went back to Cumberland to seek assistance. A search party formed the next morning, Christmas Eve, but a severe snowstorm hindered their efforts. By the time weather allowed a thorough search, any tracks or evidence had been erased by several feet of snow. Mary Caldwell was never located. The 7 disappearances within a single hunting season represented an unprecedented pattern that should have prompted a more comprehensive investigation. However, several elements contributed to the absence of a coordinated response. The victims came from different locations. Many were out-of-state visitors without local connections, and the disappearances were spread across several months. Sheriff Daniels, according to county records, was also handling labor unrest at several coal mines during this period, which occupied much of his department's resources. Additionally, the remote and hazardous nature of the landscape made extensive searches difficult, especially as winter set in. The Harlan Daily Enterprise published an editorial on January 8, 1908, noting the unusual number of missing individuals, but attributing it to the particularly harsh winter conditions and an influx of inexperienced hunters unacquainted with the treacherous mountain landscape. The editorial concluded with a call for stricter regulation of hunting licenses for out-of-state visitors, yet made no suggestion of criminal activity. Years passed, and the events of 1907 faded from public consciousness. The Blackwood property remained untouched until 1932 when the land was officially reclaimed by the county due to unpaid taxes following the presumed deaths of the brothers, who had not been seen at the trading post since December 1907. The last documented sighting of either brother was on December 26, 1907, when Elijah Blackwood made an unusual wintertime journey to the trading post in Whitley City. Harold Jenkins's diary entry from that date notes that Elijah appeared haggard and distracted, his clothes stained, and his manner more agitated than I had ever observed. Jenkins recorded that Elijah exchanged an unusually large quantity of meat and pelts, purchasing supplies that suggested extended travel, preserved foods, ammunition, a new knife, and a heavy coat. When Jenkins inquired about Tobias, Elijah reportedly replied, "My brother remains at home attending to private matters." Jenkins noted that Elijah departed heading west rather than north toward the Blackwood property, and that was the final confirmed sighting of either brother. The property was integrated into what would later become part of the Daniel Boone National Forest. The deed transfer filed at the Harlan County Courthouse on April 15, 1932, characterizes the land as abandoned and without structures of value, indicating the cabin had been destroyed or deteriorated significantly during the intervening years. No one showed interest in the remote parcel until 1962, when the Forest Service planned to construct a fire observation tower on the highest point of the former Blackwood land. During excavation for the tower's foundation, workers discovered the remains of a cabin that had apparently burned decades earlier. The site report submitted by project supervisor Samuel Ledbetter notes that the foundation extends approximately 10 feet below ground level with evidence of multiple underground rooms or chambers, unusual for structures of this region. and era. Among the charred timbers, they discovered a metal box containing 3 leather-bound journals, partially damaged by fire, yet still readable. The discovery was reported to Forest Service headquarters in Winchester, Kentucky, where officials determined the find had historical rather than criminal significance due to the apparent age of the materials. The journals were initially stored in the Forest Service Regional Office in Winchester, but were moved to the State Historical Archives in Frankfort in 1964. Dr. Eliza Montgomery, an anthropologist from the University of Kentucky, examined the journals as part of a research project on Appalachian isolation communities. Her preliminary report dated October 3, 1964, characterizes the journals as a remarkable window into the psychology of extreme isolation and the development of parallel moral systems in remote communities. Montgomery noted that the journals contained daily entries written in 2 distinct handwritings presumed to be those of Tobias and Elijah Blackwood. The entries from 1899 through early 1907 concentrated mainly on routine aspects of wilderness survival, hunting reports, weather observations, upkeep of their property, and occasional philosophical reflections that Montgomery characterized as surprisingly articulate for men with presumably limited formal education. Beginning in March 1907, however, the tone of the entries, particularly those attributed to Tobias, started to shift. Montgomery's notes indicate that Tobias wrote with growing frequency about encroachment and violations of their territory. An entry dated March 23, 1907, reads, "Found boot prints along the eastern creek bed. Strangers walking our land without permission or acknowledgement. Father would not have tolerated such trespass." Subsequent entries tracked Tobias's increasing paranoia about outsiders with progressively hostile language. By August, he was writing about setting additional deterrents along the property boundaries, though he did not specify what these involved. Elijah's entries during this period expressed concern about his brother's changing demeanor. On August 17, he wrote, "Tobias rarely sleeps, spends nights walking the perimeter, speaks often of father's lessons and our duty to the land. I fear the isolation has begun to wear on his mind. Yet he refuses to consider even our customary trading journey this month." The most disturbing entries, however, were recipes. According to Dr. Montgomery's analysis, submitted to the Journal of Appalachian Studies, yet never published, the journals contained detailed instructions for preparing various cuts of meat from what the brothers referred to as 2-legged game. The entries became more frequent and detailed starting in September 1907, with Tobias Blackwood writing on September 18, "Unexpected bounty yesterday. Trespasser carried identification from a Lexington banking establishment. Elijah processed the meat while I disposed of the remainder as father taught us. The liver was exceptionally tender when prepared with wild onions and salt. We will preserve the rest using the smoking technique father preferred for the leaner portions." Montgomery's report notes that subsequent entries detailed specific preparation methods for different cuts, with Tobias expressing particular enthusiasm for certain preparations. His entry from October 25 reads, "The older one provided better marbling in the flank portions. Elijah objects to my terminology, but father was always clear that proper nomenclature is essential to proper preparation. We are not savages. We are custodians of an ancient knowledge." Elijah's entries during this period became increasingly distressed. On November 3, he wrote, "Tobias is merely protecting what is ours, as father would have wanted. But father's hunger was born of necessity during wartime, not this eagerness Tobias now displays. He speaks of setting lures rather than merely defending our boundaries. I find myself unable to sleep, though the meat does sustain us through these cold nights." By December, the brothers appeared to be in conflict. An entry from December 14 in Elijah's handwriting reads, "Confronted Tobias about the preacher. There was no threat there. The men merely sought to bring his God to our door. Tobias said, 'All trespassers are the same. That intention matters not when the result is violation of our sanctuary.' He becomes more like father with each passing day, but father at least maintained control of his appetites." Montgomery's research was abruptly halted in November 1964, and her paper was withdrawn from publication. University records indicate she requested a sabbatical shortly thereafter and relocated to Oregon. She never returned to the research. The journals themselves were placed in restricted access storage following a review by the State Attorney General's office in early 1965. A brief memo attached to the case file states only that no actionable evidence exists to warrant further investigation of incidents occurring more than 50 years prior, particularly when no identifiable remains have been recovered. The case was officially designated historical interest and archived. In the years following Montgomery's abandoned research, a folklore collector named Martin Ridley traveled through Harlan County recording oral histories. In 1966, he interviewed Abigail Jenkins, the 87-year-old daughter of the trading post owner who had known the Backwoods brothers. The transcript of this interview, deposited in the American Folklore Collection at the Library of Congress, contains a chilling account. "My father rarely spoke of the Backwoods," Jenkins told Ridley. "But there were things he told me near the end of his life that he'd kept secret for decades." According to Jenkins, her father had once told her that in December 1907, Elijah Blackwood had come to the trading post alone, his behavior more erratic than usual. "Father said Elijah's hands trembled so badly he could barely count his coins," Jenkins recalled. "His clothes were stained dark in places, and he smelled of smoke and something father said was like a slaughterhouse. He exchanged an unprecedented amount of meat, which he claimed was venison and wild boar, though Jenkins's father noted it was packaged differently than their usual offerings." Jenkins continued, "Father said Elijah kept looking over his shoulder as if expecting someone to follow him into the store. When father asked after Tobias, Elijah became agitated and said something that father found disturbing enough to remember word for word: Tobias has developed a taste that can't be satisfied with animal flesh alone. I fear he's changing into something father always warned about." Elijah reportedly paid for his supplies with several gold coins rather than the silver they typically used. And when Jenkins's father commented on this, Elijah explained they had found the coins in a trespasser's pockets. Before departing, Elijah allegedly told Jenkins's father, "If Tobias comes looking, you never saw me. For your own safety, remember that." Elijah never returned to the trading post after that visit. Jenkins also recounted that several items belonging to missing hunters were discovered for sale in Knoxville the following spring. A pocket watch matching the description of one owned by William Thornton reportedly surfaced in a pawn shop, while a distinctive hunting knife belonging to one of the Caldwell brothers was recognized by a fellow Cincinnati hunter in a Knoxville general store. However, no connection to the Backwoods was ever established, and authorities considered the appearances of these items to be coincidental, possibly the result of theft by scavengers who had found the missing hunters' abandoned equipment. The interview concludes with Jenkins sharing a disturbing detail omitted from official reports. Her father had sampled the meat Elijah brought on that final visit and became violently ill afterward. "Father said he'd never been so sick," Jenkins told Ridley. "He described it as if his body was rejecting something fundamentally wrong. He couldn't keep food down for nearly a week afterward." On his deathbed years later, he confessed to her his suspicion that he had unwittingly consumed human flesh. "He told me, Abigail, I've carried this knowledge like a stone in my gut for years. That wasn't any deer or boar Elijah brought in that day. I have been a hunter all my life and know the taste of every animal these mountains produce. What I tasted that day was something else entirely, and may God forgive me for it." When Ridley asked if Jenkins's father had ever reported his suspicions to authorities, she replied that he had not. Who would believe such a thing? And by the time he was certain, years had passed and the Backwoods were long gone. The physical evidence of what occurred in those woods in 1907 has largely vanished. The fire that destroyed the Blackwood cabin appears to have been deliberately set, though by whom remains unknown. Forensic analysis of the site, conducted cursorily in 1962 as part of the tower construction project, indicated that the fire had burned at an unusually high temperature consistent with the use of accelerants. The project report notes that evidence suggests multiple points of origin for the fire, inconsistent with accidental causes such as lightning strikes or chimney fires. This finding was not pursued further at the time, as the age of the site placed it outside criminal interest. In 1967, before the construction of the fire tower was completed, workers discovered a series of stone-lined pits approximately half a mile from the cabin site. Forest Service reports describe these as possible root cellars or storage facilities, approximately 6 feet deep and 8 feet in diameter, lined with fitted stones and covered with heavy wooden lids that had partially collapsed over time. Work was halted when bone fragments were found among the stones. Dr. Walter Richardson, a forensic anthropologist consulted by the Forest Service, conducted a brief examination of the fragments and concluded they were non-human, likely deer or wild boar, noting that the cutting marks visible on some specimens are consistent with butchering practices common in the region. His report dated June 8, 1967, recommended resuming construction, and the pits were filled in and covered. No photographs of these excavations exist in public records, though an internal Forest Service memo requested all materials related to the discovery be forwarded to the regional office. Dr. Richardson's original field notes, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request filed in 1978 by journalist Thomas Carter, contain an observation omitted from the official report. Several of the larger bone fragments exhibit unusual cutting patterns inconsistent with standard game butchery. The precision of certain cuts suggests knowledge of anatomy beyond that typically possessed by hunters or trappers. Without more complete specimens, conclusive identification is impossible, but the possibility of human remains cannot be entirely ruled out. The fire tower stood for only 7 years before being decommissioned due to what official reports called persistent structural issues and unexplained equipment failures. Rangers assigned to the tower frequently requested transfers, citing in their reports unsettling noises and a persistent odor of cooking meat despite the remote location. One ranger, David Coleman, submitted a detailed incident report in August 1970, describing what he called an unnerving experience during his overnight shift. At approximately 2:15 a.m., I was awakened by what sounded like multiple individuals moving around the base of the tower, Coleman wrote. When I called out and shined my flashlight, there was no one visible. Yet the sounds continued for nearly 20 minutes. The following morning, I found numerous footprints in the soft earth surrounding the tower, circling the structure completely, yet no tracks leading to or from the area. Coleman requested transfer the following day. His report was filed but not investigated. The tower was dismantled in 1974, and the area was designated as a wildlife conservation zone with restricted public access. The most compelling piece of evidence that something truly horrific occurred on the Blackwood property comes from a source outside official channels. In 1968, a private collector of Civil War memorabilia purchased a trunk of documents at an estate sale in Knoxville. Among these papers was a letter dated January 3, 1908, from Elijah Blackwood to a cousin in Tennessee. The collector, Herbert Simmons, recognized the name from regional folklore and brought the letter to the attention of Dr. Montgomery, who had resumed teaching at the University of Kentucky but had abandoned her research on the Blackwood case. Montgomery authenticated the letter by comparing the handwriting with journal entries known to be written by Elijah, confirming its likely legitimacy. The letter, written on water-stained paper in fading ink, contains a confession of sorts. Dearest cousin, the letter begins, though we have never met, I write to you as my last remaining blood relation according to father's records. What I must confess may never reach your eyes, as I doubt my resolve to actually post this letter. Yet, I must set down the truth somewhere before I depart this world or lose my mind entirely. Elijah wrote that their father had taught them that human flesh contained special properties that would grant strength and longevity if consumed regularly. He claimed that their father, Ezekiel Blackwood, had survived the harsh winter of 1865 while serving with the Union Army by consuming the flesh of fallen soldiers, developing an addiction he passed to his sons through both instruction and practice. Father taught us that certain men, particularly those who lived clean lives and abstained from spirits, provided meat that could sustain not just the body, but the spirit. The letter continues, he called it the ultimate sustenance and believed it had extended his life beyond natural limits. He trained us to identify suitable subjects, to prepare the meat in ways that preserved what he called its essence, and to dispose of the remaining evidence in ways that nature herself would conceal. Elijah described how, following their father's death in 1899, he and Tobias had initially abstained from the practice, subsisting on conventional game. However, during a particularly harsh winter in 1901, Tobias had reverted to their father's ways when a lost trapper sought shelter in their cabin. He justified it as self-defense, as the men had become delirious with fever and threatened us with his knife. Elijah wrote, but I saw the look in my brother's eyes as he prepared the meat, the same hunger that had possessed father in his final years. According to the letter, the brothers reached an uneasy compromise, wherein they would only consume individuals who trespassed on their land and posed some perceived threat. This arrangement held until the hunting season of 1907, when the county ordinance brought more hunters into their territory. Elijah claimed that Tobias had become increasingly possessed by this hunger, eventually hunting humans deliberately rather than opportunistically consuming trespassers. He began to set traps not for animals but for men, the letter states. He studied their movements, identified their camps, and selected targets with the precision Father had taught us for choosing prime deer. What had once been reluctant necessity became eager pursuit. The letter states that on Christmas Eve 1907, Elijah discovered Tobias preparing a stew containing parts of a young woman who had been searching for her missing hunter husband. When I recognized female garments among the discarded belongings, something broke within me. Elijah wrote. Father had been explicit that women were never to be considered suitable. Something fundamental had changed in Tobias. He was consuming not for sustenance, but for pleasure. The expression on his face as he stirred that pot haunts me still. According to the letter, this crossed some moral line for Elijah, who claimed to have killed his brother that night and burned their cabin with Tobias inside. I struck him from behind with Father's old army shovel as he bent over the hearth. I told myself it was mercy, not murder, that the brother I had known was already gone, replaced by something that merely wore his face. I poured coal oil over everything that would burn and lit the flame that I hoped would purify what we had become. Perhaps it is cowardice that I did not join him in that pyre. The letter concludes with Elijah's statement that he was heading west to escape the hunger that never truly leaves. His final lines read, "I feel it still, cousin, the craving Father planted in us. In my dreams I taste it still and wake famished for something deer and rabbit cannot satisfy. I go west to lose myself where no one knows the name Blackwood. Though I fear that what Father awakened in our blood can never truly be put to rest. If there is a God, may He forgive what we have done in these mountains. I know I shall never forgive myself." The collector who found this letter attempted to contact authorities in 1968, but was reportedly told the case was closed.